Hello and welcome to this third edition of the Ziauddin University Faculty of Law, Politics and Governance podcast series. And this one is on international law, maritime law particularly, and in particular the disputes involving China and other states in the South China Seas. I'm Alexander Lawson, Professor of the Director of the Institute for International and Constitutional Studies. So the first question that people want to know about is, what is the South China Sea and why is it so important? Because this is where the dispute is located in the South China Seas. The South China Seas, as the name suggests, are those seas to the south of the country we know as China. Particularly, it's actually technically called the People's Republic of China. But it's China. You know it as China, as the global superpower China, where most of the world's manufacturing seems to be located nowadays. And the body of water to the south of that is called the South China Seas. This is not an ocean. Oceans are used to describe really large bodies of water. It's a sea in the same way that the Arabian Sea is the sea off the coast of Karachi, for example. It's a substantial body of water, and it's connected to all the other bodies of water in the world. It's salt water that we're talking about here. It's you can get from the South China Sea to anywhere else in the world in a boat, right? Why is it important globally? It's a large area where there are lots of resources there potentially, but also lots of trade just travels through the South China Seas. It's a important global area where obviously goods moving from China and goods and resources moving into China travel, but also lots of other states rely on the South China Sea as a point of transit. So it is globally significant. It's not just something that Chinese people care about, and of course, it's very much something that other states in the region care about. And there have been disputes about which states have control over which territory in the area, which states should have control over the resources, which is not quite the same thing, and also should there be global freedom of navigation in the area, or can China impose restrictions on navigation? The basic problem is that China takes the view that because it's called the South China Sea, there must be some kind of historical claim that China can make over it. And the problem is that there's no real basis for that. The Arabian Sea is called the Arabian Sea, but Saudi Arabia doesn't claim that it controls it. The Indian Ocean is called the Indian Ocean, but India doesn't claim that it controls it. They just called that because they're named after the states that are nearby. The English Channel is called the English Channel because of England. Again, England or the UK does not control the English Channel. So China tries to claim excessive areas of the South China Sea as being both its territory and somewhere where it can exploit resources and restrict navigation. Basically restrict the ability of vessels from other states to sail in that area. The overall legal principles that govern this are well understood. There's something called the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, otherwise known as UNCLOS, that was finally completed in 1982, so we called it UNCLOS 1982. And the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea is this massive treaty. I mean, it's a really large treaty. If you look at it in book form, it's one of those books that you can use to, prop up a table or something like that. It's a really big book. And the idea was that it was a comprehensive statement of what the law of the sea should look like. The law of the sea has developed over centuries, thousands of years, and it's actually the oldest form of international law because it's the form of international law where states first met each other that were not connected to each other. So traditionally, states knew each other because they shared a border, but the law of the sea meant that states that had no border could interact with each other. And UNCLOS is this very comprehensive statement of the law of the sea. And UNCLOS sets out certain rules about, for example, how far the territorial sea extends. And the basic rule is that the territorial sea extends for 12 nautical miles from the coastline. So if you go out to Clifton Beach in a boat and sail out to sea, if you go out to 12 nautical miles, you're basically still within Pakistan, right? But if you go to 30 nautical miles, you're now onto what we call the high seas. There's also a rule that says that states can claim an exclusive economic zone out to a distance of 200 nautical miles. And that's a zone where they can exploit the resources. That doesn't mean that that sea belongs to that state. That's only to 12 nautical miles. But out to 200, they have the exclusive right of exploitation of resources. And that's basically fish and oil and gas. They're the main resources that you find. And in fact, it's in the news recently that Pakistan has just found some oil and gas reserves within its exclusive economic zone. And so UNCLOS provides these rules. It sets down these limits. But the problem is that what China is claiming are far in excess of anything that UNCLOS covers. They're claiming far greater than 12 nautical miles territorial sea and exclusive economic zones that are just much bigger than they should be. Now, we can't get into the details too much of this because the Chinese claims are very detailed, but they're based around several flawed claims. Firstly, that there is some historical recognition that the South China Sea is Chinese because of the name as much as anything else. Well, UNCLOS doesn't allow for this. UNCLOS just deals with numbers. So this historical claim really hasn't got any basis to it. Some of the claims are based around islands. UNCLOS says that if an island is habitable, it can extend your territorial sea or exclusive economic zone. So imagine there was an island 5 nautical miles off the coast of Karachi. That would effectively mean that the territorial sea was calculated from that island, meaning that from the coastline it would end up being 17 nautical miles. Okay? And so you can see how islands are really important in extending potentially territorial seas and economic zones. But the problem is that China is claiming that any rock can qualify as an island, whereas UNCLOS says the rock has to be habitable, it has to be capable of supporting human life. And the Chinese are also doing something that isn't really allowed for an UNCLOS. They're taking islands that are too small to support human life and artificially extending them by using sand dredging to create reclaimed land. This sounds like a very strange process, but you're probably most familiar with it if you know about the islands off the coast of Dubai that were created artificially, like the World and the Palm and those. You're fully allowed to create artificial islands according to UNCLOS, but they don't extend your territorial sea. So an artificial island is just an artificial island. It doesn't mean that you can make artificial islands and then use that as a means of infinitely extending your territorial sea. China is not creating artificial islands. What it's doing is adding to existing islands. And unfortunately, UNCLOS doesn't say anything about this. But it seems to me pretty much in the spirit of UNCLOS that shouldn't be allowed. That's basically cheating. And this is the view that most states take. That there's nothing to stop you from creating artificial islands or adding to existing ones, but that shouldn't be a means of extending your claims. Because otherwise, states would just, pursue this rigorously. They'd just go out and create as many islands as they could and potentially extend their seas forever. So UNCLOS has some pretty specific rules on this, and China's interpretation of the law is, shall we say, very different from that of other states in the region. Other states in the region are concerned about this. At the moment, it's kind of bubbling under. It hasn't become an open conflict. If you watch the news, if you just Google South China Sea collision, for example, you will get news stories about Philippines naval vessels that were in collision with Chinese naval vessels. Sometimes it's not naval vessels, it's fishing boats, Chinese fishing boats colliding with Filipino fishing boats. And this is literally what it sounds like. There's ships colliding at sea, smashing into each other, which can be very, very dangerous. It can cause the sinking of one or both ships. is one of the great hazards of navigation. This is happening because China is continuing to assert its claims and other states are disputing them, and that inevitably leads to physical interaction. There is, underneath all of this, an actual legal case that resolves it, or at least should resolve it, but hasn't because China hasn't accepted the reasoning. In 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration released a ruling that essentially said that the Chinese interpretation was wrong and the interpretation of states like the Philippines and others was right. There's a little bit to unpack on this. It's not actually a decision of the Permanent Court of Arbitration. Firstly, decisions and arbitration don't really go together. We don't talk about decisions coming from arbitration. It's usually cases that deliver decisions. And secondly, the Permanent Court of Arbitration was not strictly the body that decided it. People get this wrong. They say the Permanent Court of Arbitration decided. In fact, UNCLOS provides various dispute resolution mechanisms and allows states to use them. And one of those is to appoint an arbitration panel to deal with a dispute on the law of the sea. And this is what happened in this case. The Permanent Court of Arbitration essentially just took over the administration of the decision, but they didn't actually deliver the decision. It's a very small point, but one just to bear in mind, that strictly speaking, this is not a decision of the PCA, the Permanent Court of Arbitration. And they basically concluded that the arguments of China were flawed and the arguments of the other states, the Philippines in particular, were correct. And they did this using the principles of UNCLOS. It's not that complicated. They just said there are principles involving numbers. It's simply a question of numbers and maps. We can draw where the coastline of China is, then we can add on 12 nautical miles, 200 nautical miles, etc. We may say that this island is habitable and therefore it extends the territorial sea, or we may say this island's not habitable so it doesn't. But you use the UNCLOS principles. You don't use any kind of historical claim. China's historical claims are not just based around the name. They're also based around the fact that some of the decisions on islands were made without Chinese consultation. So, for example, some of the decisions on which islands should be considered Chinese were made at the end of the Second World War, and China was not invited to give its opinion at the time. But the basic principle here is legal certainty trumps any other kind of claim. And the argument that you weren't consulted about something that happened 75 years ago, and therefore you should be able to use that as a basis to change all of the interpretations that have existed since then, is flawed. You can't go around rewriting the status of territorial seas that far after the fact, based around some fairly weak claims. Anyway, so there is this decision, although, like I said, I mean, maybe it's not a decision, maybe it's just an opinion, but we have a legal framework here. We have a body that has legal interpretive abilities, and it has rendered some kind of opinion. So this should surely resolve it all. Well, obviously it hasn't, because, like I said, if you Google collision South China Sea, there was a collision last week between I can't remember if it was Philippines Navy or just fishing boats, but there have been loads of these. And this is just because the governments of the Philippines and the governments of China are particularly belligerent at the moment. But there are other states in the region with similar concerns. Malaysia has big concerns about this. Singapore as well. So this is something that's ongoing. It doesn't look like it's going to go away. There's little prospect that the Chinese government is going to back down on this, because they never back down on anything. And this also relates a lot to China's view of its position in the world, and that some of the initiatives that you know about because they affect Pakistan, like the Belt and Road Initiative and the New Silk Road Initiative, to try and basically make sure that China always has access to the world economy. It's a lesson they learned from Japan, that the imperial Japanese Navy in the Second World War was always in a position, as well as the whole of the Empire of Japan, where it was reliant on resources from outside a lot. And they slowly realized that they were never going to be able to control access to things like oil. And that led to the desperation that became the attack on Pearl Harbor, that ultimately led to the United States entering the war and Japan being defeated. The Chinese never want to get into that position. They always want to have a position where they can get the oil they need to come in tankers and get the ability for cargo ships to take out the products that they create to sell around the world. And this is a large part of that. It's guaranteeing it at the maritime level. They're also trying to guarantee it at the level on land, where they've tried to build large railway networks and things like that. So they're not going to back down. And the other states in the region are concerned. And those states are also friendly to the West, and they're backed by the West. The West has no kind of direct interest in this. In the end, the West wants access to Chinese goods as well, because that's where most of the goods are manufactured. Your phone is probably made in China, for example. But the West is friendly to states like the Philippines and Malaysia, and therefore it kind of stands behind them in this dispute. And so why hasn't this decision resolved it? Why is it ongoing? The answer is China just refused to cooperate with the entire process. They said that the whole question is not one that should be resolvable by any kind of arbitration or legal mechanism. They rejected all of the arguments, refused to even appear in the arbitration. And then when the arbitration went against them, said that the arbitration was fatally flawed and they weren't going to abide by it. They released various documents and studies to give their reasons why the arbitration decision was flawed. And so we're in this position where we have a reasonably worked out legal opinion, but this is one of the flaws of international law. One of the states involved refuses to accept it, and unfortunately it's the more powerful state. China is by definition, in any of these disputes, the more powerful state, because it's the second most powerful state in the world. So if it has a dispute with the Philippines, the Chinese economy must be 100 times the size of the Philippine economy, and maybe 100 times the size of the Malaysian economy as well. Their military is enormous by comparison. So it's not only one of the parties to the dispute refusing to be party to the dispute, but it's the most powerful one. So that's kind of where we are, and this is the reason why, if you see these news stories, you wonder why this hasn't been resolved. The answer is, well, it kind of has been resolved as much as we can, but China is refusing to go along with the legal decision. So when you see these news stories about collisions involving Chinese vessels and other vessels, or standoff in the South China Sea, sometimes the vessels will appear next to each other and use their fighting equipment to fire water at each other, which is a kind of weak way of waging a form of, not quite armed conflict, but causing inconvenience to the other side. Sometimes a Chinese naval vessel will try and create a large wave that will push Philippines shipping vessels further away from where they want to be. It's kind of at the level of, two children in the playground sort of slapping each other before they maybe get into actually start fighting each other properly. The pushing and shoving that happens before the actual fighting. And we just have to hope that we can stop before it gets into the actual fighting, and we can come up with some kind of negotiated solution, because I think that's the only way we're going to get out of this. So anyway, that's the summary of today's talk. Is, if you see these news stories, that's where they come from. And hopefully that was interesting. And keep your ears peeled for the fourth podcast in our series. So thank you for listening, and goodbye.